Hello everyone. Now I'd like to compare the form of suffixes or endings of the past imperfect tense in the four Romance languages that I'm learning: Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Italian. I'll be discussing only the regular verbs in indicative mood, and I'll discuss all forms in these languages, even those that are rarely used or used in some varieties of the respective languages. This is not a detailed analysis, it's only a basic comparison from my perspective as a learner. So let's start. If we look at the conjugation of past imperfect tense in these four languages, we can observe that the conjugation of verbs in these four languages is quite regular and a bit simplified. Let's start with the first group of Spanish verbs, which is conjugated as follows: hablaba, hablabas, hablaba, hablábamos, hablabais, hablaban. If we look at the first group of Portuguese verbs, we can see that their endings are practically identical. Falava, falavas, falava, falavamos, falaves, falavam. The difference is caused by the difference in Spanish and Portuguese orthography and phonology. Now, let's look at the second and third group in these two languages. So first, let's start with Spanish, where the second group is conjugated as follows: comía, comías, comía, comíamos, comíais, comían. And the third group is conjugated in the same way: vivía, vivías, vivía, vivíamos, vivíais, vivían. The endings or suffixes are identical for these two conjugations. And for Portuguese, the same applies. The second group: comía, comías, comía, comíamos, comíais, comíam. And the third group in Portuguese: partia, partias, partia, partíamos, partíeis, partiam. There is practically only one slight difference between Spanish and Portuguese, and it's in the second person plural, where Portuguese uses a different vowel in the ending. Hablabais, falabais. Instead of a, Portuguese uses e in this ending. As we can see, in both of these languages, the ending changes the vowel in the ending from a to i. Hablaba, comía, vivía. If we look more closely at these endings, at these suffixes, we can see that in the second and third group, the endings are very similar to the first group of verbs, only the consonant is left out. So instead of comiba, it is said comía, vivía. Otherwise, the endings in the second and third group are identical to the endings in the first group, with the exception of change in the characteristic vowel for these two groups of verbs, second and third group of verbs. Actually, we can see that all these endings in Spanish and Portuguese in the second and third group of verbs have the vowel e, which is characteristic of the third group of verbs. If we go to Italian, we can observe a slightly different situation here. Let's go through the first group now. Parlavo, parlavi, parlava, parlavamo, parlavate, parlavano. Now let's go to the second group of Italian verbs. Credevo, credevi, credeva, credevamo, credevate, credevano. And the third group of Italian verbs is conjugated as follows: aprivo, aprivi, apriva, aprivamo, aprivate, aprivano. Here we can see that in Italian, all three groups of verbs are conjugated in practically the same way, only the characteristic vowel in the ending and the suffix changes. So the first group has a, parlavo, the second group has e, credevo, and the third group has i, aprivo. Otherwise, the endings, the suffixes are the same. If we compare the suffixes in Italian with Spanish and Portuguese, we can see that there is some difference in the first and second person singular, parlavo, parlavi, hablava, hablavas, and in the second person plural, where Italian has parlavate, credevate, aprivate, and Spanish has hablabais, and Portuguese has falaves. So the ending is slightly different. Not too different, but slightly different. So we can see that Italian strictly distinguishes the three groups of verbs by preserving their characteristic vowel a, e, and otherwise the system of the Italian conjugation here is very regular. If we look at French, we can see that there is some regularity. Again, if we'll look at the French verbs, we can see that the first and third group of French verbs have identical endings. So let's go through the first group of French verbs, which is conjugated as follows. Parler, 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 parlions, parliez, parlez. And the third group of French verbs, which is conjugated as follows. Vendez, 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 vendions, vendiez, vendez. We can see that the pronunciation and the singular is identical for all persons, and the pronunciation of the third person plural is the same as well. If we look at the second group of French verbs, we can observe one phenomenon here that appears in some other forms, in some other tenses in French. We can see that the endings are again the same, like in two other groups of verbs. However, we add the syllable is before the ending. So for the verb finir, the conjugation is as follows. Finissez, 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 finitions, finissiez, finissez. We can see that in French, the endings are a bit different than in the other three languages. Perhaps we can feel some similarity there. However, it's more distant than the other three languages. So, if we look at the conjugation of the past imperfect tense in Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Italian, we can see that on the whole, it's quite regular, quite similar. In Spanish and Portuguese, there is no difference between the conjugation of the second and third group. In French, we could see that the conjugation is practically the same for all three groups of verbs, with the exception of adding a syllable, is, and the second group of verbs. And in Italian, we could see that the three groups of verbs are strictly distinguished by their characteristic vowel in the endings. Otherwise, we could see that conjugation in the past imperfect tense in Italian is very regular, with some minor differences from Spanish and Portuguese. The suffixes in French are a bit different than in all three other languages, but they are the same for all three groups of French verbs. So, this was the overview of the forms of regular verbs in past imperfect tense in Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Italian. If you have some other observations or examples, you can mention them in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and see you again next time. Goodbye.